I'm very excited about having Dr. Ellen Brown on this morning. She's an attorney, and she's going to discuss with us how we lost control of our finances in the United States and how publicly owned banks will bring financial Armageddon as far as the Rothschild-controlled banks. I'm sure that's what she's talking about. In addition to that, her research skills as an attorney practicing civil litigation in Los Angeles. She's the author of 11 books and will be releasing another in 2000 and apparently 15 focused on public banking. I guess that's correct. I'm not sure, Ellen, you need to give me that in a second. In Web of Debt, her most recent book, she traces the history and the evolution of the current private banking systems. She shows how it has usurped the power to create money from the people themselves and how we, the people, can get it back. She's written over 100 articles on the subject since The War of Debt was first published and is the inspiration and thought leader behind the Public Banking Institute. Ellen, my pleasure having you today. We've been talking about this Rothschild-controlled central banks all morning, so how do you want to start this?
Hi, thanks, Ted. Well, first I'll say, actually, I have written a second book, which is called The Public Bank Solution. It's already published. And I've actually written 300 articles now.
Sorry for the old information that I received on you, but I'm glad you got over 300 articles and you have a second book now. What is it called?
The Public Bank Solution. That's actually my 12th book, but 2 books on banking.
We were talking at the beginning of the first hour about how so many of these wars that we're having are banker wars. And so why don't we go ahead and
right.
see what you think about that and what we can do. And give us the background of how all of this started, what your take on this is, and how these banking institutions have taken over the world.
Well, they began by they create our money. It's banks that create money, not government, as most people think. I mean, you look at your dollar bills and your coins and you think the government issues the money, but that's not true. Banks issue money every time they create a loan. That's where most of our money supply comes from. Like 97% of the money supply is digital, and all that digital money is created on computer screens in the form of loans. And the catch is that they create the loan at interest. So you always have to pay back more money than they put out there, than they actually create. So since virtually all money is created by banks, somewhere somebody has to take out another loan in order to find the interest to cover the original loan. So what you have is a pyramid scheme where more and more borrowers continually have to be sucked into the bottom in order to support the lenders at the top. And at the very top is the central banking system. So the backstop of the banks is the central bank. In the 19th century, before we had the Federal Reserve, there were banking crises on average every 6 years where you would have runs on the banks, and these would happen because at that time money was actually gold, and the bankers would issue these bank notes, which were promissory notes to get the gold. But they issued many more promissory notes than they actually had gold. So this was on the presumption that people only came for their gold about 10% of the time. But if they became suspicious of the banks, or for some reason thought the bank didn't have enough money, they would all try to get their gold at once, and of course then the bank didn't have the money, and so there would be a panic, and people would lose their farms, and it was an unhealthy situation. So then when the central bank stepped in, of course our Federal Reserve was modeled on the Bank of England, which was privately owned. And the central bank, the Federal Reserve, which was set up in 1913, had the power to create money on its books. Well, in 1913, we were still on the gold standard, so the system still didn't work.
So it's been an interesting morning already talking about the health aspects of all of this and what's going on with people with stress and how people are becoming awake of what's happening. So, Ellen, are you finding now when you do more and more shows that people are starting to wake up to this, or are they still pretty much sitting in the rocket chair watching TV?
Well, it depends on the audience, but yes, people are definitely waking up. I think more and more people are not trusting the major media and are looking to alternative sources of information, and they're getting it. But I agree, as you say, the central banks are the kingpin here. It started with the Bank of England, but then in the 1890s there was depression, almost as bad as the 1930s depression. And in Australia, this is worldwide. In Australia, they set up in 1912 a national central bank. In other words, a central bank that was actually owned by the government. And this bank did remarkable things. They issued credit, and this was like state credit, and rebuilt the whole country. And they did funded roadways and seaways, and they funded Australia's participation in World War I. Well, that totally freaked out the Bank of England, which had kept control, even though the British had lost control of their colonies politically. They kept control through the banking system because everybody had to turn to the Bank of England for their ultimate source of credit. But since Australia was proving that you did not need this central banking system, that you could set up your own banking system and fund everything you needed in your country, the banker, well, originally it was just the Bank of England set up this. After World War I, the British were so indebted that they really couldn't do it by themselves. So there was a meeting they set up the Bank for International Settlements, which was composed of 4 major central banks. And the goal was to keep control of this whole monetary system so that people in the entire industrialized world would be required to get their money ultimately from these central banks. I mean, that would be the ultimate source and the ultimate backstop and the ultimate switch that could turn the money on and off at will. And that's what we just saw, for example, in Greece, where with the new Syriza party, which was attempting to renegotiate the Greek debt, the central bank just said, you have to play it our way or we'll just turn off the taps. They have the power to turn off the spigots to any one of the Eurozone countries because they are the central bank for all the Eurozone countries. They've given up their state sovereignty to the Eurozone, to the ECB.
Everything you said is exactly right. Also, a lot of people don't know this from the history standpoint. That was one of the biggest problems that Adolf Hitler had in World War II and in the 30s and the 20s. And that's one of the planks that he ran his entire Nazi party on, is that they needed to get rid of the privately controlled Rothschild central bank, and they needed to nationalize the banking institution in Germany, which is what Hitler did also, and he was able to fight World War II without any debt. And then he continued to use the Bank of International Settlements to run gold and money through in order to continue to fund the Nazi war machine. And this Bank of International Settlements is as evil at the core as the rest of these central banks. It is the central bank of central banks. Have you read the book, The Tower of Basel?
Yeah, actually, I made up that term.
You're the one who made it up.
I think I made it up. Anyway, I wrote an article with that title, and then the book appeared later. I've written a lot of that.
But the thing that people don't understand, and this is what Ron Paul has said, I have said, you have said, explain to everybody who's listening how simple it would be for Congress to come in, repeal the Federal Reserve Act, and turn around and nationalize the Federal Reserve System that we have in the United States and dismiss all of this fiat currency debt and all of this illegal debt they've done. Explain to how easy that would be for everybody, please.
It would be. The hard part is getting Congress or the legislators themselves to understand. Everybody has had this myth of the Weimar hyperinflation imposed on us. Like if we allowed the Treasury to just print the money, in other words, if we allowed the government to just print the money, they would hyperinflate and devalue the currency. But that was not the cause of the Weimar inflation. It was actually, at that time, the German central bank was actually privately controlled, and it was they were printing money in order to satisfy the short sellers. So they were printing more and more money because of speculation that was going on, and this was going on because Germany owed this gigantic unrepayable debt after World War II. Everybody knew there was no
after World War I.
World War I. Yeah, everybody knew they couldn't repay this debt, and so it was speculation and the fact that they had a debt to in a foreign currency that they could not pay, whereas we in the U.S., our debts are in dollars, so we can always pay our debts. We can always print the money as needed to pay our debts. And, there are certainly models historically, but my favorite model is the colony of Pennsylvania under Benjamin Franklin. I mean, there are plenty of models or Australia was a great model in the 1910s, 1910 to 1923, 1912 to 1923. Canada didn't.
How do we wake up Congress, Ellen, and get them to repeal the Federal Reserve Act? How do we do that since they're on the toll for these guys? These guys are basically bribing them with all of these campaign contributions to these central banks that they own through Citicorp and all the rest of them and Goldman Sachs, and they're huge campaign contributions. How do we get them to say, turn off the money spigot to us and vote against us? I mean, how do you go around doing that when this whole thing seems to be a collusion together of all of these powers that be?
Yeah, it is really. I actually ran for state treasurer in California, and I could just see there is no way a third party can match these. I mean, you have to have the money in order to get on TV, et cetera. Anyway, and most people do their voting according to TV. Most people just check the little boxes, the D's and the R's, and the politicians themselves are definitely under the thumb of Wall Street. Wall Street calls the shots. So that's the reason that, I founded the Public Banking Institute. So what we're trying to do is start locally. You could set up local publicly owned banks. We have one such model, only one in the whole country. That's the Bank of North Dakota. In North Dakota, they're the only state that escaped the credit crisis. They've got the lowest unemployment rate in the country. Their economy just works remarkably well. And like all banks, they create money in the form of loans, but they can then lend to themselves. Basically what they're doing is keeping their own money in their state instead of sending their state deposits off to Wall Street. They're keeping them in their own bank, leveraging their own capital and backed by their deposits into loans for the state, which they can lend at very low interest rates. And of course, they have very low overhead. They don't pay bonuses, fees, commissions. They don't have high-priced CEOs. Their president, I think, gets paid about $240,000 a year, compared to $20 million for the Wells Fargo CEO. So there are many ways that this is a very efficient model, and it serves the local community. So what we're hoping to do is to set up such banks all over the place. In Germany, they have the Sparkassen, which they're the dominant form of bank in the local communities in Germany, and these are publicly owned local banks, which their mandate is to service the local businesses, and that's what they do, and that's why the German export business is so strong for such a relatively, it's a country the size of California, and I don't remember which number they are there, but they're right up there in terms of, their economy works really well.
They're number 3.
Okay, number 3. And it's largely because of this public banking model that as you say, actually started during the 1930s.
Well, no, the Sparkasse in Germany is it's local.
Oh, well, that's true. They go back, they go back way back to I think they were religious to start with, because the poor people just couldn't afford the up to 60% interest being charged by the usury banks. So in the Bible it said that, there was this big conflict about whether you could lend at interest at all. And originally you weren't allowed to lend at interest at all. But then it was evident that the poor people they didn't have the money, so they would go to these lenders who were charging insane rates of interest. So I forget whether it was Anyway,
you remember what happened in 1913 when the central bank came into power, and then all of a sudden we started having all this loose money. They started really increasing the M1 money supply. When this happened, it led to the roaring 20s, and then through 1929 with the stock market going crazy with speculation, and finally they contracted the M1 money supply on purpose because they wanted to have the greatest land grab in the history of the United States, in which they seized literally tens of thousands of family farms farms and businesses and homes because the people simply couldn't pay the money back because there was no money in circulation because of the contraction of the M1, and all the powers to be were kind of warned by Winston Churchill before that happened. Have you ever read the book on Churchill and what happened? When Churchill went around warning everybody what was fixing to happen because the Bank of England was still controlling the United States through the Rothschild banking cartel, which is just a subsidiary of all of that. And what happened is they contracted the M1 money supply, which sent the stock market into a huge nosedive, and people were diving out of windows, which led to the bankruptcy of the United States in 1933. And so people don't understand what happened and how we were manipulated by these central banks. We're back with Alan. Man, Alan and I are having a party here off break here. We were talking about all kinds of these things we can't tell you guys on the air. So there you go. So we're going to be taking phone calls here in about 5 minutes at the bottom of the hour. I was talking to Ellen, and we were kind of discussing this, and I want to know, why Alan Greenspan and the boys at the Bernanke, now we've got Yellen, why they all say that they don't have to answer to the laws of the United States, why they don't have to be audited, except for that one little short audit they did with Ron Paul. And whether you think Rand Paul is in the same image as his daddy, or do you think he's going to be capitulating to the international banking community? So, Alan, answer me that question before we go to the bottom of the hour break. Why do they think, not that they are, but why do they think that they aren't accountable to the U.S. people, but they can control us through debt, but they're not answerable to the laws of the United States? Explain that to me, because I don't understand that, because I know they believe that.
Yeah, well, it used to be that the central bank actually was more or less answerable to the government. This is true globally, and they actually, like in Europe particularly, the central banks were used to create credit for the local economy. But then in 1974, there was the Basel Committee that at that time we were going through what was called stagflation, where we had inflation, but the economy was stagnant. And this was blamed on the fact that governments were borrowing from their own central banks or printing their own money, it was blamed on governments. But in fact, what caused the stagflation was the fact that oil quadrupled, and this was because of an engineered war that where there was the boycott and so forth of oil at that time. So everybody had to have a lot more in dollar reserves than they actually had, because countries globally suddenly had to borrow from the Wall Street and London banks in order to get the dollars to buy the oil. There was the deal between Henry Kissinger and the OPEC countries that allegedly this was after, of course, the dollar went off the gold standard and the dollar was plunging, and so Henry Kissinger got together with some big wigs in 1973 in Sweden, big bankers and financiers, and they came up with this new plan where the dollar would be backed by oil. So Henry Kissinger met with the OPEC leaders, or the Shah of Iran, I guess, at least, and made a deal that oil would be sold only in dollars and that the dollars would be put in U.S. banks. Supposedly, Henry Kissinger said, we are going to make you very rich. We are going to quadruple the price of oil, but in return, you will sell your oil only in dollars and put your dollars in our U.S. banks. So that put all the countries in debt because they didn't have the dollar reserves, that they weren't anticipating this. So there was that. They had to borrow for that. There was the fact that labor was very strong at that time, so they were always negotiating for higher wages, which would drive up prices. There was the fact that the interest rates, that the central banks were wrong in their policies, and they thought that the way to control inflation was to raise interest rates so people would borrow less. But in fact, what that did was to increase their costs, because the cost of interest is a major cost of every producer. They all have to borrow before they have a product to sell. They borrow to pay their workers and materials, and then they pay off that credit line later with the, like 90 days net when they have their products. So if interest rates go up, then costs go up, and so prices go up. So there were other reasons that the prices went up, but it was blamed on the government, and so the Basel Committee came up with these new rules where the deal was that you were supposed to not borrow from your central bank, but governments were supposed to borrow on the open market, and the central banks were supposed to be independent of government. So they were not supposed to be like at the beck and call of government, serving government, but they were supposed to be serving basically the banks. I mean, well, they were supposed to be maintaining the stability of the currency, but what that meant basically was serving the banks, because the less currency there is out there, the more the banks can lend and the more interest they can charge and the more money they make and so forth.
And you know what's funny now is that the majority of our bonds, when they go into the open market, are being purchased back by the central bank. Because nobody wants their bonds anymore. I mean, so we're going to come to phone calls here just in a second. Now, if you want to get a copy of my book, you can get it on Amazon, or you can get it at healthmasters.com. Ellen and I have been talking here. Ellen, what's the name of your latest book?
The Public Bank Solution. It's also on Amazon.
Okay, the Public Bank Solution.
Yeah, and I do write all about that, the Kissinger deal, all about this whole central bank, the development of the central banks and how they got their power and how we need to get it back and how we can get it back.
Well, I'm going to get a copy of that. I wish I had a copy for this interview because I want to read that, because I love reading stuff like this, because I just learned about Kissinger in Sweden and all of this stuff and making the banks independent of the governments, and so they were no longer answerable to the laws of the United States. Because I always wondered where these guys got off saying that stuff. I never understood it. So apparently it happened back in the mid-'70s when they made the deal with the Saudis for the petrodollar, and they were told that the oil prices would apparently go up 4 times, and they would make a fortune on the petrodollar, but they had to only trade in U.S. dollars, and that's the little catch that they decided to use to stabilize the U.S. currency after we got off the gold standard, because the dollar was in free fall. Is that pretty much summarize it all?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, Renee, one of my favorite callers here in North Carolina. Renee, you are on the air with go right ahead.
Yes, for many years now, I've been hearing everybody argue on who the boogeyman is, okay? Yep. It's the Rothschilds, the Masons, the Jesuits, the communists, the Nazis, the Federal Reserve. To a degree, it doesn't really matter, because we hire government employees who take an oath, a salary, and a very generous pension and earlier retirement than we peasants get, okay? And that's what they're paid to do. They are paid to protect us from all these people, and they have allowed the Federal Reserve to go on for over 100 years. When we talk about all these groups, that splinters us into different groups. We need to focus on who we paid and who has not done their job. There is an agency over every institution, medicine, Wall Street, everything. The thing is, they have the power. All our institutions have been allowed to become corrupt because our government employees did not do their job. And too many people are apologists for these people and make excuses for them, and that needs to stop, or we just as soon agree that we are going to live under tyranny.
No, you're absolutely right, Renee. I love it when Renee calls in, because she always takes us back to the basics, that we've allowed them to do this to us. And you're right, Renee. You're absolutely right. Any other comments? Any comments you want to make for that, Ellen?
Well, I would just make one comment that I don't think the people that represent us actually represent us. I mean, they're not actually the people we would choose if it was up to us. In other words, people don't get elected unless they've basically agreed to go along with the program, the big money program. And then they do in office. For the most part. Of course, there are.
So, Ellen, how do we fix this? I got Renee on the line with you right now. How do we fix it? How do we get the right people in office? If they don't go along with the big money program, they can't be elected. How do we get these bums out of Congress and out of the legislation? How do we do this?
Well, we would have to change the laws on financing for elections. But then how do we do that? How do we change anything when they're in power? It's a very good question. So that's why I think, the people I work with, we all think that we have to start sort of at a grassroots level. Ideally, if we wake up enough people, we need a grassroots movement the Occupy movement obviously had a big impact, and the Tea Party movement had a big impact. But what we need is, it seems to me, is a sort of common understanding or some common goals or solutions that we can all get behind, because right now we're at the point where people are still arguing about what the answer is, so we can't really have a united front when we don't agree. We don't really totally understand.
And Ellen, how do you get national media attention when they don't want you to have national media attention, when the Rothschild banking cartel controls the AP wire and the Reuters wire network, and if you try to run on an alternative ticket, look what they did to Ron Paul. I felt so bad for him in the debate. I mean, he's sitting on national TV, and they'd give him like 90 seconds on a one-hour debate, completely ignore him when he was the only person telling the truth, and the rest of the people on the platform were pretty much all lying. How in the world do you get a candidate to get through this cartel, this banking cartel conundrum, so to speak, of not being given any media attention? Maybe, Renee, you got an answer for that. I don't know how to do it.
Well, like I said, I think we're very splintered, because everybody kind of wants to point to the group, the demographic group they have issues with. But the thing is, I hear all these Christians say, well, I'm scared that they chip me or they vaccinate me. Well, who would come to your door and do that to you? A government employee. And the thing is Mr. Rothschild's not going to show up at my front door. And it's so much easier to have to blame a boogeyman that's way farther away instead of the one that might be sitting at your own dinner table, okay? See, too many people in this movement have either worked in the system or have relatives within the system. Well, they'd rather point you in the direction of looking at the Rothschilds overseas, which we can have absolutely no impact on, than maybe the people that are in our own families at our own Thanksgiving table who this could not go on. The ruling elite, their numbers are too small. They can do nothing. They're a bunch of old men generally, unless you have order-following yes men who will carry out the work. Those are the people who are a danger to you, who will show up your door and lock you in a cage.
Yes, right. Thanks so much for the call. Ellen, what's interesting about this is that, Renee's right about this, but again, you said you tried to run for Treasury on a third-party ticket in California and basically just didn't get any traction whatsoever because you can't get any media attention when you do that.
Right. Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think we have to wake people up gradually. I mean, you can do it in your homes, talking to people. You can do it on, radio shows like yours or alternative websites or just, the Internet in general. I think the Internet is really going to be our savior in the sense that now we do have access to alternative sources of information. When you go to school, you're fed information. They tell you what to learn, and then you learn it. But on the Internet, you have the ability to seek things out, and you can have a hunch for what you think it really is, and then put that in the subject line, and voila, somebody will have researched it.
As long as we don't lose our rights on the Internet, you're absolutely right. I think the Internet is going to be the thorn in the side of the New World Order. Annette in West Virginia, another one of my favorite callers. You got a question or comment for Ellen Brown? Go ahead, Annette.
Yes. Just a slight correction, please. God prevented biblical Israel from charging interest among their own people, but they could charge interest to outsiders. Now, in the modern Israelite situation, you have the reverse. The biblical Israel founded the West. They are the Adamic white blushing Christians who founded the Western nations, and the opposite, the children of Cain, now control the money system. If you look at Genesis 4:1, you will find that Adam and Eve, Adam knew his wife Eve, semicolon, and she bare Cain. That semicolon told you very diplomatically that Cain was not Adam's son.
Okay. And thanks so much, Annette. What do you think about that, Alan? Are you familiar with any of the biblical references on that? Thanks so much, Annette.
Well, I never noticed the semicolon. That's an interesting point. I had never thought of that.
Okay, let's go ahead and go to Matt in New York. Matt in New York, you got a question for Miss Ellen Brown. Dr. Ellen Brown.
Yes. Good morning, Power Hour family. This is Mayad in New York City. I want to say, Ted, I appreciate it when you take the time with Renee and Annette to let them finish some points. I want to connect this to what I was trying to explain, and I'm hoping on an open line session I will be able to finish explaining the Southern strategy of Nixon and Reagan around mass incarceration of black people. And my question and comment to Ellen, and I love your work, and I hear you on PRN, so make sure you give us the time on Gary Knowles Network. But my question is, while Occupy is not much around, you have a tremendous grassroots movement, Black Lives Matter, and many, many names, because especially the youth. And they're dealing with what started out as a slave patrol and continued lynching by another name. 21 times blacks are likely to be executed without
let's talk about the bank. We got to talk about Thanks, Maya. Chris, let's go ahead and go to Chris in Florida. Chris, you got a question for Ellen on the banking system, please.
Well, Ellen, I appreciate that you support alternative forms of commerce like community currencies, and which I also agree is the most dynamic, but there are also time banks and public, not private barter networks, which I also advise, and cooperatives, swap shops. But as you were mentioning, Ted, at the beginning of the show, that the Federal Reserve issued the principal, but they never issue the interest, and that is borne out in modern money mechanics from the Chicago Federal Reserve, where when you sign a loan document, you give permission to the Fed to issue the principal, but of course the interest is never issued. So the collateralized property is taken and credit is ruined, people file bankruptcies, and eventually the Fed ends up with, and their member banks end up with all the physical property. Now, we may not be, as I forgot the lady's name earlier who said that, we shouldn't be complaining about the demographics. We shouldn't complain about the parasites. Instead, we should just take away their weapon of debt enslavement, as I just outlined, which is usury. And there can be no doubt it's usury. If we do that, we can also take away our compulsion to hate those who we allow to enslave us. And I don't believe that money should be commodity-backed, because human productivity is limited only by time. So it should not be limited by currency based on any one commodity or basket of commodities. And once we increase our standard of living commensurate with technology's rise, we can become more civically active, prevent wars, and as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, a great video called "Pastors and Peace Activists Against Usury," and also Annette mentioned nashak, which is translated as snake bite from the Torah, which is a mortal sin to commit usury, and is also prohibited in the Quran, called riba. And it's also, of course, prohibited in the Bible. So all of these religions agree that usury is a mortal sin. And these are the virtual chains from which we can easily free ourselves by simply changing our currency for the better. We may not be able to save all from usury, but we can surely save some from usury by those who wish to participate in these equitable commerce media.
Well, you're right, Chris. And what I also look at, too, is this, we need to stop learning that you don't have to do what Madison Avenue says to do. You don't have to be put into a brainwave alpha state because of all the advertisers. You don't have to buy the latest, greatest gadget. You don't have to buy things you don't need with money you don't have to impress people you don't know by paying interest on it. Simply not necessary. Ellen, what do you think about Chris's alternative there?
Well, I agree, and that's probably our most practical approach, is to simply abandon their system. In other words, the big banks won't be too big to fail if they don't have our money in them. If we can pull our money out and put them in our own banks, our own publicly owned banks, which is what I favor, or that would be your national currency, but you could also have local currencies. You can have local sort of Bitcoin-style electronic currencies that are just mutual credit clearing systems. But then you still have the problem of our government monies are in the big Wall Street banks, and as long as that's true, they will be considered too big to fail. So that's what we're doing with the Public Banking Institute, is trying to get our government monies, our local government, like our state government monies, bring them back into the state. And then if you set up your own bank, I think the problem, usury, I've written on this and I can't remember the exact definition, but actually I've spoken in Malaysia 4 times at a riba-free conference. And they keep inviting me, although I'm talking about public banking where you actually do charge interest. But here's the difference. In a public bank, the interest goes back to the people. It goes back to the community. So there are some ways in which interest serves a good purpose. First of all, if you have, even if everybody is well-meaning, you will have some defaults. And so in order to cover the defaults, you charge interest in order to, make the system balance.
What do you think about that, Chris? What do you think about if we have to be away? Would you do it through fees or would you do it through interest? How would you cover the defaults?
Well, money is a dismal science, as I forgot the historical economist who said that. So interest may be possible, but usury in the classical sense really is the issuer of the currency and credit, which of course is the Fed, who issues the principal but not the interest. And, interest usury isn't loan sharking, as many believe. Roger Ellison covers this historically.
But how do you cover, Chris, how do you cover the losses? I mean, Alan made a very good point. Would you do it through fees?
Yeah.
Would you do it through an aggregate total? I mean, how in the world did they do it in the early colonists in Pennsylvania when they did that, Alan? How did they cover the losses if they had people and they were issuing their own money? I mean, how would they do that? I mean, how would you?
Well, they did. In the colony of Pennsylvania, they did charge interest. It was a Pennsylvania-owned bank, a land bank, and they lent to the farmers at 5% interest. Of course, at that time, the colonists were printing their own money. So let's say you would print $105. You could lend $100 to the farmers at 5% interest, spend the $5 on roads and bridges and whatever the community needed, and then you would have $105 out there to pay principal and interest.
Oh, excellent.
So the interest would basically fund the government. It was for things that the people needed. And if you are the borrower, here's my concern. If you don't have interest, I've been in community currencies where people just don't pay, or they just say, well, gee, I don't have it this year, maybe next year. I mean, what if everybody could borrow $1 million? They would, and they'll say, I have this great idea. I know I can pay this off in a year, let's say, and then it doesn't happen, and they say, well, next year, I think I can pay it off next year if you just give me a little more time. If you don't charge interest, the other alternative I've heard people say is, well, you'll just say you can't use our credit system anymore if you don't pay it back. But that's very brutal to say a small startup business that really is almost there. They almost made it, but not quite. If they could just pay a little interest and carry the loan one more year, they really actually might make it. So I think interest serves a purpose. And then I've been in Malaysia where I've talked to people who are in the supposedly usury-free system, and they say then you have the banker considering that he is a partner with you, and then he starts running your business. So that's
okay, we're going to a break right now, Ellen. We'll come back. Excellent comments this morning. Excellent. Oh man, I love the listeners. We'll be right back. We're going to go through some really quick phone calls right now. You guys are going to have to keep it really quick because I got 3 minutes to finish this. So make a quick comment. I'm going to have Ellen do a quick comment back, and I've got 5, 6, 8. I've got a full board of calls. Let's do it as quick as we can. Rob in Minnesota, you've on hold. What do you want to say to Ellen?
Morning, Ellen, Ted. Yes. You talk about the boom-bust cycles, and Matt Taibbi wrote an article called The Great American Bubble Machine. Mm-hmm. And Ellen has been a champion of what's going on in North Dakota in their banking, and I'm real suspicious of the oil bust and driving oil back down to the price where it's hard to make money off of fracking.
Thanks so much, Rob. Ellen, what do you think about the oil bust they're having right now that seems to be messing Putin up, but it's also messing up North Dakota too? What do you think the real reason for that behind is?
Well, I wrote an article that it was highly suspicious that our Secretary of State met with I've forgotten now. Anyway, the Saudi No, it wasn't Saudi. Anyway, there is reason to believe it was manipulated in order to get Russia. In other words, it was forced down suddenly, too fast, in order to get Russia, to get Iran, and
to make sure the central bank stay in charge. Okay, Wayne in Tennessee, real quick, go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead, Wayne. You got about 10 seconds. You got a quick question.
Yes, the Knights Templars set up the first banking system.
That's correct.
Okay, just wanted to bring that in. Second, socially, you can look at government as started out as a macrophage system, and the social engineers have changed it over to a virus or a viral system.
Okay, thanks, Wayne, for the call. Knights Templar, what do you know about those guys? I mean, I know they were big back in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, well, you go ahead on that.
I'm going to pass. We don't have time. David, Arkansas, go ahead.
Agreed.
You got a question
I like
or comment
the
for Alan Brown?
macrophage versus virus. I'd like to hear what he means by that, but go ahead.
David, Arkansas, go ahead.
Oh, yes. The only thing about the government employees, they all have to team up together, or they'll all lose their jobs, or I guess they can go live with Renee until it works. They need to strike or something.
Well, no, you're absolutely right, David. If all the public employees start going against their own government, they're going to be out of work. Thanks for the phone call. We're going to go to John in Michigan. John in Michigan, you got a question or comment for Ellen Brown?
Ellen, you're great. I'd like to get you on the air up here in northern Michigan. How can I get in contact with you with that in regards to a great radio program up here?
Oh, thanks. My email is ellenhbrown@gmail.com.
ellenhbrown@gmail.com, and now you're going to get the barrage.